Hi there, everybody. My name is John Wilcox, and welcome to this Worms 25th anniversary panel. I'm joined today by some of the old guard, the stalwarts, some of the veteran developers of the Worms franchise from over the last 25 years. They're still at Team 17. They're still knocking it out of the park. They're doing brilliant stuff. Guys, why don't you give your names and your positions at Team 17, and we can take it from there.
Sure, I'm Andy Morris and I'm the principal animator at Team 17.
Hi, I'm Nick Gomeso. I'm the Director of Art for Team 17.
Hello, I'm Kevin Carthew and I'm the Creative Director at Team 17.
Now, you guys have been with the company for a long, long time. You've grown up over the last 20 years plus with the company. You've seen Worms develop and become the phenomenon that it continues to be to this day. Can you give a bit of background onto how you came to be at Team 17 and your first experiences of Worms? Go on.
Sure. Well, I came to Team 17 in 1997, just as Worms Armageddon was being worked on. I'd come from virtuality before that, making VR games in the very early days of VR.
The first generation of VR games.
First generation VR, very clunky. So I joined in 97 and I've been with Team 17 ever since.
Amazing. So, and Kev, how about you?
I joined not long after Andy, actually. I joined in 1998. It was really kind of like, it's my second proper job, really, like almost right out of college. Joined in the QA department, so playtesting games. And Worms Armageddon was my first experience of working on a Worms title as a tester. Before that, like Team 17 was the game developer of my hometown. I was always a huge fan of Team 17 games growing up, so the chance to work at Team 17 was like genuinely like a dream come true for me.
I started in the games industry in '96 for a company called Gremlin Interactive. Came to work for Team 17 in 2002. Starting on Worms Sports. It's the first Worms game I worked on as an artist.
Amazing. Okay, and you've also worked your way up since then. Talk about your experiences with Worms prior to coming to Team 17. Did you play the first games? What are your first experiences of the franchise?
I think it would be very similar for a lot of us in that Worms was just, well, everybody knew Worms. It was just a popular game, the 1 and 2 certainly for me. An after pub game with friends. Worms was everywhere.
I think it's a similar story for us all, really. I mean, I always remember Team 17 obviously with Worms and with games like Alien Breed. I used to love playing those with my friends on the Amiga, and and that's how I kind of first got to know Team 17.
For me, I used to play it with my friends. It was an Amiga game. Was developed on the Amiga. Came out first for the Amiga. Me and my mates were all still like very sort of like nerdy, kind of like console wars, firmly entrenched in the Amiga camp. And I can literally remember walking home from school with friends and them telling me about Worms for the first time and trying to describe it. And the game that it was often compared to Lemmings. And I think that's because of the destructible environments, the small creatures, tiny little sprites on screen. But I mean, anybody who's played the two games knows that beyond those visual similarities, the games are very, very different. But yeah, even though they were shareware games, similar to Worms, I remember nobody being able to quite describe it at the time. But I do remember that we played it an awful lot. And I think, similarly to a lot of people have said that we've met at trade shows variously throughout the years, probably all of our exam results suffered in some ways from playing Worms a little too much.
I think one of the things that I remember with Worms, and not that I'm this panel is about you guys and your experience with Worms and the franchise and things like that, but I think for me, playing the early games was trying to come up with names for each of the characters, and being a teen at the time, it was all about, do I want to name them after superheroes, or do I want to name them after TV characters or whatever, which was always. That was half the battle. Some people spend a lot of time doing character customizations, and for me it's trying to think of names for Worms. How did you guys approach your naming conventions for your worms? Were they family members? Did you not? Did you just leave them by default? What's all that about?
I think for me it was often family members, but it would also be, of course, the people that you're playing with, I think I'm not sure why, but yeah, family members for me would have been the most common thing. Yeah.
I was just I can't quite remember what I started out naming the worms with. Probably something rude as a 15-year-old schoolboy. But it is really surprising to me and really interesting, like how much that matters to people. Like I can remember the early days of QA. It was testing. It must have been testing Worms Armageddon, and we really needed reinforcements on the testing front. And the publisher actually sent over some testers from America to play with us. I can remember playing against those guys, and just the ritual of them going through before every single game and making sure that the worms all had the correct names and they were all named in the correct order. And yeah, it really adds something to the game. You know, mechanically it has no bearing on the gameplay, but it's surprisingly important to people.
Nick, did you do family members as well, or?
Yeah, I think you do. You always do it based on your friends, don't you? But it's like especially typical on the newer games where you can like customize them and you can make them feel like, you know, whether it's a superhero, whether it's, you know, it's what your friends look like, or, you know, I think that's part of the beauty of Worms, you know, being able to do that, and it makes the whole experience far better, I think.
The first game that I worked on from a design point of view that I was really involved with, Worms World Party, I named all of the worms in my team, because back in the days then, the default teams, the developers would have a default team that actually ship with the game. My game was called Team Chesh, named after my nickname, and all of the worms in Team Chesh were named after the housemates that I was living with in student digs at the time. And they were absolutely stoked about that. I think that there's a version where the back of the box you can see Team Chesh on there, and it actually had all of my housemates' names in print. They absolutely loved that.
For many people, Worms Armageddon is perhaps the pinnacle, arguably, of the franchise. For them, it's held in and continues to be held in very high regard. Kev, it was the first Worms game that you worked on since starting at the game. What is it about Armageddon, do you think, that continues to stand out for the community? What makes that game so special?
It's quite hard to put precisely into words what it is about Armageddon, because there are certainly other versions of Worms that have come along and have, say, had more features, been more feature complete. But it really comes down to, with Armageddon, you know why it's special when you play it. It's got a real tightness to the gameplay mechanics. Everything just feels right in that game. The way that the physics work, the very sort of like cartoon wormy physics, it comes down to how the worm feels kind of like satisfyingly grippy as it makes its way around the landscape. The entirely deterministic and predictable way that grenades bounce around, and I guess that kind of plays into, you can't quite master worms because there are so many variables involved in playing a game of worms, and the random factor makes every single game different. But you can almost have mastery over the control system. And this is quite easy to look up. You know, it's still astounding to us if we watch videos of like the top tier Worms Armageddon players. They can do things with the ninja rope that, like, you know, even we in QA at the time could only dream of. You know, it really just feels incredibly tight and incredibly satisfying to play.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps Worms WMD, which is the most recently released Worms title, ahead of Worms Rumble, which of course is coming out later on in the year. You know, that was very much inspired to be perhaps a spiritual successor to Worms Armageddon, coming 18 years on, something like that. And you know, how do you go about trying to replicate, and this perhaps can open up to the three of you, how do you go about replicating that wonderful experience, that sort of core experience for WMD?
I think we started essentially with Armageddon, didn't we, Kev, in terms of like the AI. So the whole point was to make a faithful successor to the original game. That was the original intention for it.
We were very conscious, as you said, John, about like the enduring appeal of the Worms Armageddon game, or any of the Worms games that use that engine. Worms World Party uses the same engine, has the same look and feel, and we were conscious of that being such a fan favorite. So we really wanted to almost start with that as a basis. We couldn't just start with the Worms Armageddon code. It's a really old code base, but we did pay a lot of attention to exactly what was going on under the hood to make that game feel so special, to make it feel that tight. And that was really the idea of replicating the feel, the physics of Worms Armageddon was almost like the bedrock that we wanted the rest of the game and the game's features to be built on. So it started with that feel. It had a very different look, which Nick and Andy can probably talk about. But then the design team really wanted to build on top of that feel more contemporary features and things that would add to the Worms gameplay and complement the Worms gameplay without moving it too far away from that, hugely successful fan favorite in Worms Armageddon.
Well, I would comment that, I mean, obviously I would pay enormous credit to Danny's original Armageddon sprites, which were just beautiful. And we took a lot of care to reference the original animations when we came to doing WMD, and even down to the detail of trying to match up things like the movement of the worm when he's walking and jumping and roping, making sure that the timings of the different animations kept the same feel as WMD. Yeah.
I mean, visually, we wanted to create something that was almost like hand authored. Every single time you played the game, even though it's generated, we wanted to make it feel like it was a beautiful painted picture painting, and that was one of the main kind of like, not a hurdle, but one of the things we really wanted to solve for the game, to make it, rather than just being a slice of a landscape, which a lot of Worms games have been up to that point. We wanted to really take it forward and produce something really different, and that's where a lot of the focus was. From a visual point of view, is creating this kind of like beautiful landscapes.
I mean, the look there, you're talking about the look, that's certainly changed over the last 25 years. The look of the worms themselves. Nick, how do you go about, essentially, it's almost a redesign with every iteration, every couple of iterations of the franchise, but it's a worm. How on earth how do you start with that?
I think you have to be very sensitive to the design of the worm, to the feel of it. I think if you look at a lot of the designs, it's just subtle pushes. We've got the kind of like an almost like a Mickey Mouse type character. You don't want to spoil it too much. There's something very special about that design. So we're always like putting just little artistic flicks, little, just pushing it in this and that direction, depending on like current trends and pop culture and so on. So to make it always relevant, I think that's the key thing. Making it relevant, and I think we've been pretty successful at that over the years.
And Andy, about taking the beautiful art that's developed for the game, how do you then proceed to animate that, and how important is it to retain or tweak the animation with each iteration? How do you go about that?
Well, so our starting point would always be the technology that's being used to make the game. So what platform is it on? Is this like a 3D rendition of the worm or a 2D rendition of the worm? And then then there's a technological challenge on how you can actually achieve this in the first place, and that influences quite a lot to do with the look. So if you looked at a game like Open Warfare, for instance, this was a sorry, some dog barking there. So if you looked at a game like Open Warfare, this was an attempt to get the game to run on a PSP. So we had to do a new 2D version of the worm, but not using the sprite system like the Armageddon and the games that had come before, because the PSP couldn't deal with sprites. So we needed to find a new way of solving that, which we did, I think, quite successfully with that one. And that went on to be a system that we used in a number of 2D Worms games with increasing sophistication. So that's the main challenge is dealing with the technology that it has to run on at the time.
And of course, there's the leap then that the franchise made from 2D to 3D in Worms 3D. Kev, some of the design challenges of that game. Can you talk us through about how you take something that's essentially a 2D flat map and bring it into a 3D space, and some of the challenges that the team had to work to overcome, and how you overcame them?
For a long time, they were probably more technological challenges than they were design challenges. The thinking at the time for bringing Worms into 3D was probably fairly straightforward. I don't think we tried various things, such as, would it be a 2D game still with 3D graphics, or would it be a 3D game, as in it would be represented much like what you see in Worms 3D, but maybe there would be a camera view where you would have like a cut through render of the landscape, so it was still playing 2D. But they all seem to be attempts at just making the 2D game again with 3D graphics. And I remember for a long time, the challenge was all about really like, how do you aim in 3D? How do you judge depth in a 3D environment when it's a 2D projection on a monitor screen? And for a long time, I think we just accepted that you couldn't. And then there were several attempts at prototyping, which sort of proved that maybe you could if you aimed in first person. And so that was the solution, essentially, that rather than having the 3D over-the-shoulder camera view, when you aimed in first person, you hold down a button, go into the first person mode, and take your shot from there. It definitely, I think it simplified the strategy. I don't think there's as much strategy in the 3D games as there are in the 2D games. A lot of that comes down to the technology again, having less landscape to play with, having fewer objects to take cover behind. But yeah, for an awfully long time, it was more a technological hurdle than it was a design hurdle. Several prototypes were made that contributed towards us being a little bit more confident that it was something that we could pull off. But it was really a breakthrough from one of our programmers, a chap called Andy Clitheroe, that really came up with a way to make the landscape deform in a way that is Worms like. For a long time, we were using something called the height map, which meant that you could have hills and mountains and things like that, but all you could really do was pull down the height of those hills and mountains. You couldn't punch holes in things like you can in the 2D version of the game. And Andy's solution really enabled us to do that. And it was really when we had that technical solution, it felt like in the company there was so much momentum behind this idea of making a 3D version of Worms. And now we had the technological solution in part. That's where everything was going. And then everything else from a design point of view, by hook or by crook, kind of got figured out along the way throughout development. And
if I'm wrong, the solution is voxel based. Is that correct?
I think so. I remember describing it one time as voxel based, and I got castigated by Andy because he was like, "That's not how it works at all." I think the last time I remember him describing it to me, I think he described it as being voxels but rendered with polygons. It's essentially like, it's a little bit like Minecraft, but way ahead of when Minecraft was developed. Essentially, you have these landscapes that are made in a very specific way. Everything is already a really, really heavily subdivided polygonal mesh. So all of the deformation kind of already exists in the landscape. There are faces willing to be turned on and off to be removed out of the landscape. So you can, almost like 3D pixels, which is what I suppose voxels are essentially.
Amazing. I don't think we can have a panel on Worms and its 25-year history without talking about the weapons of Worms. People will have their own favourites, but I think everything from exploding sheep to holy hand grenades to concrete donkeys to, pokes to dragon punches and everything in between. Talk me through some of those weapons choices. Again, how on earth do you come about developing those weapons? And how do you ensure that there's balance amongst them all when it comes to the full game?
I mean, there must be some weapons that we've designed from a visual point of view, because it feels like that's how we got started designing weapons in Worms. It felt like that for a long time, everything in Worms was some silly thing or some pun or some kind of like parody of something that was happening somewhere in the world at some time. Like there was the the mail strike. I think that came about when Royal Mail was striking in this country at the time. There was like the mad cows, which was like the mad cow BSE epidemic. But they were all pretty much some form of some silly iconic thing that would explode. And I've talked about this before. There was definitely a point in time when we stopped considering just doing daft things that would make the biggest explosion, and we started thinking about things that would increase the depth of the game strategy and the depth of the gameplay, lead to more and more rewarding situations. In terms of balancing them, that's quite easy in Worms, because for a long time there's been a thing called a scheme. That is the armory that all of the worms go into the game with, and almost like on a per scenario basis, you can determine whether those weapons appear or whether they don't appear. Everybody knows that the concrete donkey in Worms, from a balancing point of view, is like completely unbalanced. It's almost broken, but that's okay because it only appears like 1 in every 50 games, and everybody always accepts that if you got the concrete donkey in a crate somehow and you won, you were just fluky. You know, it wasn't your skill. You can always just say bitterly, you were just lucky to win that.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, do you guys have a favorite weapon? I mean, I don't want to be, you know, typically Welsh and stereotypical, but I mean, the sheep, you know, is not even my favorite. So I'm just going to say it wasn't my favorite. I liked, again, from you guys, I always enjoyed getting people getting right on the edge of a cliff and just poking them off to their death.
I think from a visually impressive weapons point of view, the Armageddon's pretty, you know, satisfying when when that launches and obviously the entire thing blows up. I think that's pretty satisfying. But everybody loves, like you said, everybody loves the sheep. I think that is a cool one.
Yeah, specifically the super sheep. It's there's a real tension when you use the super sheep and you're flying it around. You know, it's and people are waiting to see if you're going to smash into the landscape or or drop him into the sea, or if you're actually going to take out half their team. It's a real fun weapon to use, and as an animator, it's a great fun weapon to actually work on as well.
I would have said the sheep.
You can still say the sheep. It's okay. You can still say the sheep.
I do have a fondness for the sheep. I would like to highlight, though, it is surprisingly difficult in Worms to make weapons and utilities that really endure. If you look at like the core weapon set, it's not changed an awful lot since the very first game back in 1995, because that's just so well balanced. It gives you such a nice suite of tools for playing the game. So it is difficult to come up with things that endure. I think one of the things that we did in Worms Open Warfare 2, we introduced the electromagnet. It either attracts weapons or it repels weapons. It has 2 settings, and that's a really fun one. And it leads to all sorts of chaos. It looks great if you say drop an airstrike on top of a repelling electromagnet and it just scatters the bombs around the landscape. And that is one of the weapons that I think is, it's become a staple essentially. It's one of the few weapons that we've introduced, and it's really had staying power, and it's really expanded the depth of the game's tactics. So yeah, special shout out for the electromagnet from me.
Absolutely. Good shout. Good shout. There have also been, of course, spin-offs in the franchise over the last 25 years or so. And some have made it and some haven't. I know that there was rumblings of a karting game back in the day. Does anybody want to sort of explain more about that, how it came about, and you'd have played it. I was on Team 17 at the time. How did it feel, and how does it sort of step out of the typical karting subgenre?
I don't know about how it was created, but it's certainly from a visual point of view. I mean, that was the first title I worked on when it came to work for Team 17, and I was just impressed at the time. It just looked so good. Visually, it was probably. Kev can allude to. It's one of those titles that almost came to the point of it. It could have been released. It was quite close to that. But visually, it's a great product to work on, and visually it looked really, really good. Worked with some fantastic artists at the time. I just remember it being a fun diversion from the normal game. Yeah. Yeah.
It started out as being Mario Kart with the Worms characters essentially. So you didn't necessarily always play as a worm. The sheep was a character in it. The skunk was a character. They all started out in karts, and it was like a Worms licensed version of Mario Kart. Partway through, I think it wanted to be a karting game as well as a deathmatch game, and partway through it stopped being like Mario Kart. It became a little bit more like Twisted Metal. And I remember the final game became possibly more like Quake than Twisted Metal. All of the other characters were gone. The worms were just in tanks now. And it was almost like a third-person shooter, like an arena-based third-person shooter. It was in development for an awfully long time. And like Nick said, it did look fantastic. And it's always puzzled me why we didn't do something with it, because I remember I think the thing that we landed on, you could have probably released. It was really, really polished. It just never quite saw light of day. I think maybe the reason it didn't quite see light of day was it had already cost so much money to develop. It had been in development for such a long time. It probably ended up being a really expensive project. And it was a time as well where it was much more difficult to get games to market. You know, you didn't have digital storefronts like Steam. Everything was reliant on physical still. You needed a publisher really to get that kind of investment. And I don't know for sure, but at the time, maybe we just couldn't quite attract the interest from a publisher. But it was a good game.
And do you guys have a favorite installment? As I said, there's been an absolute plethora of Worms games in the last 25 years. What's your favorite Worms game and why? And you could have worked on it or not.
I think for me, I've always been really proud of Mayhem. I think it was such a technological achievement, and it was a lot of fun to work on as well. I worked very closely with Andy Clitheroe on the technology for that, and we did a lot of I think very quite impressive things with the worm, both with the worm and the environment. So just the movement of the worm, the animation of the worm, his ability to look at the camera and to look at another worm and to point, to gesture with both hands independently at moving targets and things. It was doing some very sophisticated things for the time. So that was a lot of fun to work on. Very satisfying.
For me, it was Open Warfare 2 on PSP. Absolutely loved working on the game. I think it was my first role at Team 17 as lead artist. Worked with Kev on it. Again, great team, really enjoyable. It was one of those products where everything ticked a box and it just worked. And the end result was a fantastic product that kind of still holds up well even today. You can see the videos on like on YouTube. You can see the little FMV sequences we made, and they're still really high quality. It's it was a lot of fun memories working on that game. For
me, I think similar with Nick. Open Warfare 2 really stands out in the memory. So does Worms World Party, but I think favourite game is probably WMD. It's the closest that we've gotten to Worms Armageddon. I think it has some features that really enhance the gameplay. I think it has incredible art direction. Little bit of a new take on the worm. I just think it's a really, really feature complete, solid, all round package. I think it's a really, really good installment of the classic Worms formula.
Amazing, that's absolutely brilliant. And of course, looking ahead to the future, we've got Worms Rumble as a separate panel during the show on that. It might already be available if you're watching this on demand. Talk us through about very briefly about Rumble. Of course, you guys have had a key hand in the development of that. You've been with the company for a long time. Talk us through about your experience of working on Rumble at the moment.
Well, Rumble was an idea that was, the basis of real-time worms was an idea that was often talked about at Team 17. So it had gone through a lot of input before it started developing. We'd done, I'd done some animation mock-ups of the kind of thing that it might look like, talking with the developers and just trying to visualize how this would really work. It was very early on, it became clear that we would need a new way for the worm to move, because you couldn't just walk really fast. He needed to be able to roll around, and then and the gameplay needed to be very fast and dynamic, so he's going to be a lot of jumping and firing, and then you've just got the continual the challenge of the new challenge of the fact that all worms are continually active. So there's no idling going on with the worm. He's always in the action. So these were all new challenges for us to deal with.
How did that work for you, Andy? With I can remember many conversations like in the past where we've sat down to like make a new Worms game, and I can remember thinking back to Worms Revolution, like some of the early input, like we had these ideas, like we were quite interested in like those old Tex Avery cartoons at the time, and like how those characters like stretch and deform and pull these super exaggerated expressions, and you've always like had a really sort of like really I'd say deep understanding of like what the character can actually do, you know, and things like those. We walked back on those ideas about Tex Avery, because how does that play when there are worms stacked on top of the worm, or what happens when he clips through landscapes and things like that. So you've always really, I think, known exactly what the character is capable of. And it feels like a lot of the time, because the game's so variable, the classic game's so variable, the landscape can be in all sorts of different states. We've been quite limited with what we can do with the character. But then with Rumble, we're coming to you and saying, okay, well, now he's not really the worm anymore. You know, he's more like Spider-Man. He can jump off walls. He can hang to walls. He can move around really, really quickly. And that's all completely new. So like, how has that been, like that transition from classic Worms game to the Worm in Rumble? So
what are you doing? You're taking over my job.
Sorry, John. I'm just genuinely interested now. We haven't had this conversation.
I'm going, guys.
The challenge for Rumble wasn't really any different, I think, for me with any other game, because it's gameplay above everything. When it comes to animation, you have to work within the constraints of the gameplay. So you've got to respect the collision volume of the character, during the different animations. You've got to just make him he's got to work properly, and so yes, you sometimes you can imagine or want some really distorting animations, but often there's a very good reason why not.
I think the key difference with like the Rumble, the requirement for the Rumble worm was it had to move a lot faster. I know it's on this, but that was something that we'd battle with for years, you know, on Worms, because he's quite a slow moving character. The kind of like just the physical form he takes. He hasn't got arms, he hasn't got legs. It's quite a, you know, how do you actually move that forward in terms of what was done previously? I think that was probably one of the bigger challenges, wasn't it, Andy? The subtle things, yeah, sticking to walls, the things, that's a really cool thing to do. But the real thing was the rolling, wasn't it? That was where we made the biggest gains.
Yes. So we tried a few things. I remember trying a kind of trying to make a worm run, a kind of a snaking kind of run, reminiscent of Sonic the Hedgehog in his sort of upper body position. But rolling him up just once it, so I think I thought of it. Was
you've said it now, Andy. You thought of it. It's fine.
It's yours.
It's my fault. Okay, I'll take that. Rolling him up just seemed like a very natural thing to do, like Sonic into a ball. That becomes a very natural way for the worm to move really fast and then bounce off things and jump around. It just seemed like a really natural fit.
Brilliant, lovely, fantastic. I think that's everything that we've got for on the panel. I want to thank you, the three of you, Nick, Andy, and Kev. Thanks very much for joining us on the panel. And yeah, I think it's what's really great is that, of course, we can revisit many of those titles on platforms even today, which is really exciting. We can kind of see that evolution over the past 25 years. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for all your contributions amongst, Teamsters past and present to the franchise. But you guys are on here, so thank you very much for your contributions as well. Thank you very much, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.